And we will go ahead and get started. So if you haven't yet, please take a moment to just introduce yourself into the chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from. If you have anything you are hoping to get out of today, what brings you here, let folks know, and we will use the chat this way. So quick note, if you aren't super familiar with the Oakland Literacy Coalition, we are a coalition, obviously here in Oakland, really committed to seeing that through partnerships and working together that we believe every Oakland child will learn and love to read. And so our work is really through the many of you, so many of our partners in the room today, our member organizations, knowing that you all do so much work on the ground to elevate literacy, to see kids, families, communities thrive and succeed. And so we try to host forums like this once a quarter that really bring perspectives and voices from the field together, bringing often many of you all to elevate the work you do in your practices. We now do an annual conference, which we will bring back in October of this year, again, our Literacy and Justice for All conference, and then through our members, try to also do additional sort of workshop and programming support. So I'll make a quick plug for our February session, which is typically a member-only session, but this year we are opening that up to the rest of the community. It will be featuring the incredible Dr. Sabrina Bree Moore. You should check out our conference event page from October, as well as our social media. We've recently reposted her great session that she led for us, and she'll be back to lead a 1.5-hour training on the third Wednesday in February. Typically our stuff always with the OLC happens on the third Wednesday, so please check that out. And I might ask my team, maybe Shani, if you could drop the flyer and the Eventbrite link. So if you are interested in joining us for that next month. I am going to just kind of introduce what we are doing today. So I've shared a little bit about overall the kinds of programs we do and how we've done it in the past. This winter, we are piloting sort of a new format, a new way of doing things where we're really trying to go deeper on whether it's a theme or a series, to really think about, instead of just having kind of one touch point on a topic, how we can really offer different ways of having and hosting conversations. So today's conversation is the first one in our 3-part series that is really focused, anchoring around February being Black History Month, but bringing Black History Month beyond just the month of February to really go deeper on themes around Black history, as well as education, and thinking about what it means in our programs to serve Black youth well. So that is what we will be doing for the next few months. Again, I think Shani just dropped, if you want to check out the Eventbrite link for what's coming next. But today, to kick us off, I am really excited that we are going to have Tyson Amir from Freedom Soul Media with us to lead today's kind of seminar. And really going to hand it over to him to take it away and do what he does. He is the author of Black Boy Poems and has created the Black Boy Poems curriculum. He's the founder and director of the Black Literary Collective and the revolutionary education consultancy firm Freedom Soul Media Initiative. They have worked with over 90 school partners and delivered more than 330 programs, served more than 25,000 students and counting. He's an author, musician, educator, community organizer, born and raised here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we are so happy that he is with us here today to kick us off on this great session together. So again, I will hand it off to Tyson. And in the meantime, if anyone has questions, something you need help with, just go ahead and message me. So welcome, Tyson, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanam. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the OLC. Greetings, everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Tyson Amir, and I'm excited about our session today. I'm definitely excited about being here. I am the author of the books Black Boy Poems. So if you're not familiar with Black Boy Poems, I strongly recommend you taking a look at it. It's a very important collection of work. It's a social political commentary, which aligns with a lot of what's going to be presented over the next 30, 45 minutes to an hour that we'll be talking about. And then in addition to that, so when I had the idea for this book, Black Boy Poems, I knew that it was going to be extremely useful in community and also in classrooms and however we want to define classrooms. And a lot of what I'm going to be presenting is going to be like using some of the education buzzword terminology is going to be a decolonized way of approaching things. So if we think about classroom in a decolonized way, we're having a classroom here on Zoom. It could be something that if you got some folks around you in your neighborhood or at your house or wherever, and you have some information that can be extremely valuable, engaging, and enriching, that can be used to develop learning opportunities that are going to be extremely valuable, right? So I knew that this work was going to do that. So I wanted to design a curriculum for it that could help teachers take that content and expand on it and create more learning opportunities. So that's what the Black Boy Poems curriculum is. It's being taught right now in middle schools and high schools because it is California Content Standard Aligned and Common Core Standard Aligned for social studies, for English, for ethnic studies, and for art classes. I think that's very important for you all to hear because sometimes, right, you might hear somebody has a book or they have a curriculum and we think of it however we process that because words have specific meaning to us as individuals, but I want to give you some context and criteria for that. So this is serious material that has been created and is being utilized in the community at this very moment. And what we are going to be building on in the slides that I'm going to present shortly, it's an extension of that. It's part of the reason why I felt Black Boy Poems was necessary. It's part of the reason why I felt the Black Boy Poems curriculum was necessary. And then another thing that was mentioned is my company, Freedom Soul Media Education Initiatives, which is my education consultancy firm. So in addition to publishing books and curriculum, I design programs and do trainings and workshops and a variety of things under the umbrella of my education consultancy firm with schools, school districts, community organizations. And the focus is same thing. How do we decolonize this learning space to make sure that Black students and other students of color are able to succeed and thrive with the information that they're receiving? So that's a little bit about me. And as we move through the presentation, I really want it to be organic and free flowing. So if there are questions, if there are reflections, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that's presented, feel free, throw the stuff in the chat. There might be some times when I stop the share and bring us back to gallery view so we can see each other and, you know, we come off mute and have some discussion about that. I'm going to do my best to be cognizant of time to make sure that we do have some time towards the end where we can discuss a lot of this information in community. But I'm really excited. I'm thankful for the opportunity. And I really hope that you all feel the time that we spend together is beneficial with the information that we discuss. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, Sanam, are you able to see the slide?
I am. I can.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. So we're going to begin by rooting this in the historical context or historical context that I think is extremely important for this space, which is the Black tradition. There are two traditions that have been seminal to the development of what we see now was being referred to as the United States of America. We have the indigenous tradition and experience, which oftentimes gets silenced and minimized and marginalized. And then we have the Black experience, which gets silenced, minimized, and marginalized. We're not going to do that. We're going to firmly root this presentation in that. And so to do that, we're going to one of their ancestors. We're going to the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And so keep this in mind because we're going to be talking about the institution of education, how it has evolved and what we now refer to as the United States of America. So this is what Garvey was saying. He was saying a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. For many of us, right, if we reflect on our school experience, if some of us are teachers right now, or we're part of the learning space and we're thinking about the learning experience of students that we know right now, how many of them, and then thinking about you and your experience, how many of you would say in your school experience, you learned about your past history? So however you identify yourself, like the community, the culture, the history that you come from, how many of you feel that you learned about your history? For many of us, that answer is going to be no. in your school experience. You may have learned about it in your community. You may have learned about it in other places or on your own, but in your school experience. So if you're thinking about, your K-12 experience, if you did all of that, if you went on to, college or university after that, how many of you learned about your history? Most of us, no. How many of you learned about your origin? Most of us, again, that answer is going to be no. How many of you learned about your culture? For a lot of us, that answer is going to be no. So using this formula from the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, what he's saying is that your school experience, and some of our students are going through this right now, their school experience is turning them into exactly what he says we don't want: trees without roots. You're not rooted, you're not grounded, you're not connected to a knowledge of yourself, a knowledge of your community, your people. How can you grow? How can you develop if you're not put into a place where you can learn about yourself? And then going beyond that, right? This is the culture of education that we have right now here in 2022, where if you have a student that finishes K through 12, once they get to their 12th grade, they finish that, they get a diploma. That diploma is a symbol, which means that they are supposed to be educated. They have some level of education, but here in the United States of America, an education for so many of our students is one where you have learned nothing about yourself. You've learned about a whole bunch of other people, but you ain't learned about yourself. This don't work. This ain't real. But this is the brand of education that we surround ourselves in or have been steeped in here in the United States of America. It's problematic. The ancestors were calling that out. Let's continue. We'll bring another one into the space. This is another very important historical figure, Steve Biko. He says the greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Just think about it real quick. The greatest weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. When we're talking about education, when we're talking about the institution of education, more specifically, he says a battlefield. Ideas, knowledge, information, the control of it, who has access to it, who doesn't, it's important. And if you are feeding or you are creating a learning space where people are not able to learn about themselves, you're starting them at a space of deficiency. You're underdeveloping. We don't want that. But what we're going to do is we're going to begin to uncover how this thing arrived in the form that we know it is. Let's go a little bit deeper. We're going to bring in another historical figure, Comrade George Jackson. He says, I now know that the most damaging thing a people in a colonial situation can do is to allow their children to attend any educational facility organized by the dominant enemy culture. It's a deep, profound statement and extremely on point. Your history is not going to be taught. If your history is taught, it's going to be taught in a way that is manipulated, watered down. I was doing some presentations with some of my students in one of my programs yesterday, and we were talking about, Dr. King, because they weren't in school on Monday for, honoring Dr. King's birthday. I'm asking them, what have you been taught about Dr. King? It's like, I have a dream speech and nonviolence, and like, that's all we know. That's all we're being taught. Like, there's so much more to the story. There's so much more to that history. But when the history is in the hands of an institution that has never valued you, they're going to give you your history in a way that is stepped on, watered down, dumbed down. That's what George is saying. I now know that the most damaging thing a people in a colonial situation can do, and make no mistake, this is a colonial situation. The United States of America is a colony. It is an imperial colony. Stole land from indigenous people and has continued to occupy and steal land and resources from other peoples across the planet. This is a colonial situation. To allow their children to attend any educational facility organized by the dominant enemy culture. It's deep. This is why we have what we have. Let's go deeper and let's localize it even more. Very important historical figure. Co-founder of the Black Panther Party, chief theoretician of the Black Panther Party, Huey Percy Newton, talking about his experience in OUSD schools. During those long years in Oakland public schools, I did not have one teacher who taught me anything relevant to my own life experience. Not one instructor ever awoke in me a desire to learn more or to question or to explore the worlds of literature, science, and history. All they did was try to rob me of the sense of my own uniqueness and worth, and in the process nearly killed my urge to inquire. Huey was one of the most powerful minds of the 20th century, no doubt about it. There's no argument, there's no debate. A genius. But in his school experience, this is how he describes it here, right now, where we are in Oakland. I don't know if everybody's in Oakland that's on the Zoom, but right here. He felt that he was being robbed of his desire to want to inquire, to want to learn more, by what he had to deal with on a daily basis in these schools. And it wasn't because he didn't want to learn. It was because the institution was designed a specific way. So why? Why was it designed that way? Why does it function the way that it does? Let's explore. So, some things to just put in mind as well as we go through this history. What are the stereotypes of Black students? Like, think about that in terms of their body, in terms of their mind, in terms of their behavior and their morality. What are some stereotypes that we know of that are used to frame the Black mind and the Black body when it's in the learning space? Just think about that. Also think about this. Where did they come from? Where did those stereotypes come from? Did they come from Black folks? Or did they come from other folks who have a particular gender prejudice bias about Black folks and what Black folks are doing? And then let's think a little bit deeper on that. What purpose do they serve? All right, I hope y'all ready. Like, we're just warming up right now. It's just the early stretch, you know what I'm saying? If you need to, get you some water. We're about to go in. Y'all ready? Let's go. So to try to give some context to this, where these stereotypes come from, what purpose do they serve, and some of the other history that we've been talking about, let's go here. I really like to begin with this founding father, Thomas Jefferson. Interesting figure. Let's look at his view of the Black mind and the Black body. There's him, third president of the United States, writer of the Declaration of Independence, notes on the state of Virginia, celebrated historical figure. He says this in reference to Black people: "But never yet could I find that a Black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration. Never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are more generally gifted than the whites, with accurate ears for tune and time, and they have been found capable of imagining a small catch. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved." For real? Thomas Jefferson, for real? This is what you're saying? And like, let's also situate this correctly within global history. I think we all know the very first people of our species come from a continent that's now referred to as Africa. That's not an indigenous name for the continent, but that's where our species originates from. We also, in situating this in a correct historical context, the first civilizations ever established were on that continent as well. The first people to develop math, science, art, spirituality, religious systems, developing technology when it comes to education, architecture, anything like that, that originates from that place. And it didn't just stop at a time thousands and thousands of years ago. It continued to evolve, and people and the cultures there have impacted the world up until this present moment. So this is a dude that understands history, that understands that, but instead of being able to recognize that and find a balance with that knowledge and that understanding, wants to superimpose the biased and the racist narrative to fit what he is trying to do and his colleagues or his comrades are trying to do in the time that they're living in. So as a result, he's saying these people who are the mothers and the fathers of our species and of civilization, and which is a historical reality. And that's not to say that this group is better than any other group, but the very first people come from the continent that we refer to as Africa, the very first civilization, so on. That's the historical record. But he's saying, but never yet could I find that a Black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration for real. So you who wants to honor Greek culture and tradition, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, where did they study? They studied in Kemet. You who wants to honor a man like Pythagoras, where was the Pythagorean theorem developed? It was developed in Kemet. So it's a cognitive dissonance at the highest level. But this type of thinking is not just him as an individual. This is part of a culture. And this is a culture that then later on is going to develop an institution of education that is supposed to teach Black students, Indigenous students, and other students of color correctly? For real? Let's go deeper. He said a lot of things, right? Like we could have just made this whole thing about him, but we not. We just gonna give him a little time and then we gonna move on to some other stuff, right? So this is him again. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the Blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar ostrom of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name and are below the dignity of criticism. The heroes of the Dunciad are to her as Hercules to the author of that poem. This right here, this is him taking a shot at Phyllis Wheatley, incredibly gifted Black woman, writer, poet, the first Black woman ever published in what we now refer to as the United States. So he took time out to say, this woman's writing is below the level of criticism. It's nothing. He wanted to try to insult the intellectual ability of this woman. And he did this multiple times to other folks as well, and was challenged for some of that stuff too. But I'm using this as a way to set up a cultural view. I was asking y'all, what are these stereotypes? Where do they come from? They didn't come from Black folks. They didn't come from the Indigenous folks. They didn't come from us. They came from people that had a specific agenda and a prejudiced view and a racist view, and also a view that was predicated on we making money out here. You know what I'm saying? So what do we need to do to continue making this money? And then the cognitive dissonance of these are human beings, but we can't treat them as human beings if we want to keep this thing moving the way that it is. So how can we do this intellectual gymnastics to view them in a certain light, which makes us feel better about how we treat them? Let's continue. Another major Western historical figure, George William Friedrich Hegel, Hegelian philosophy, studied in universities to this day, had the audacity to say this: Africa has no history and did not contribute to anything that mankind enjoyed. Do you feel me? If we're starting to feel a little uncomfortable about the history, I mean, that's all right. Let's be real about the situation. This is the type of thinking that then becomes actions, policies, laws, decisions being made that build foundation for institutions that impact people on a daily basis. But let's add a little bit more to it. And then let's step outside of the Western tradition for a minute, and let's bring some other things in, because we want to talk about school. And that's another thing that's important. Let's decolonize our mind when we think about school. School is not only done in the tradition or the manner of Western European countries and cultural preferences. It's not. As we already talked about, the earliest or the oldest people, the people who are the mothers and the fathers of our tradition, you know what I'm saying, as a species, come from the African continent, or what we now refer to as the African continent. As the first people who make up our species, that's where they come from. They were the first ones to establish major civilizations, build these institutions, schools, all of that. So we have people, Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe, South America, the Caribbean, all over, who have established their own institutions of education for their people, which is important because we know we learn through culturally relevant means. So let's decolonize our way of thinking. The way that we do school is not the only way that school has been done historically, is being done now, or should be done. So let's look at some other systems of education. Here in the Western Hemisphere, and very close to where we are, the Aztec people, they had a system of public education that was free for every young person in their society. This is what they did. They learned math, they learned science, they learned their culture, they learned their tradition, and they didn't charge their young people to attend school. They had a culturally relevant way of being able to teach their people. There were indigenous, as in indigenous or native peoples here, systems of education all throughout the Western Hemisphere. So then you take people like this who are accustomed to learning in a specific way, and then you try to force them into these schools that are based on an English or a French or a Spanish model of education. It don't work. You have to take into consideration the cultural preferences and the cultural tendencies of your students. So we have this. For Black folks, for people who are descendants of people from the African continent, many of us are descendants of people from, West Africa, where you might have some folks who come from more Central Africa, from South Africa. For many of us, we don't know where our ancestors came from because of the most brutal version of forced enslavement that people have ever witnessed or experienced. We don't know. We're cut off from a lot of that history. But for many of us, we generally come from some parts of West Africa. So a major West African institution that existed, that was bringing valuable education to people in the community, and then also peoples throughout the world at that time, was Timbuktu, a world-renowned institute of knowledge and education. You had people traveling from Europe, people traveling from Asia, people traveling from all different parts of the world to go study at Timbuktu. Timbuktu is, so brief West African history, you have the Ghanaian Empire. The Ghanaian Empire is followed by the Malian Empire. The Malian Empire is followed by the Songhai Empire. Timbuktu exists during the latter periods of the Ghanaian, going into the Malian, and then the Songhai Empire. Still exists to this day, impacted hundreds of thousands, millions of people, learning in a culturally relevant way. These are people that know how to teach. These are people who know how to learn. Again, think about that. You take folks who have a cultural way of engaging in knowledge, engaging in learning, and then you force them into another space that doesn't value them, that doesn't appreciate them, and then doesn't take their cultural preferences into consideration. And then after that, you want to step back and say, these people are dumb. Come on now. Nah, that ain't true. That ain't true. Let's continue. In England, and we can highlight other Western European countries, there were educational systems that were developed there. This is an example right here, a quick illustration of what English classes for folks who are more lower class, they would have access to. You had to pay to go to school. You had a school with one teacher, a couple of teachers, or a classroom with one teacher, maybe a few other teachers, a whole bunch of students in there, and they're engaging in instruction and learning. Not to say this is bad, not to say that Timbuktu was better, not to say that the Aztec example is better. These are different ways that people engage in creating a learning space. But then it becomes problematic when we say, this is the preferenced way of doing or the right way of doing it, and then we superimpose that on other people's without taking into consideration their culture and the best ways that they should be learning. Because we know culture is essential for being an effective educator. So for those who are teachers or who have worked in spaces like that, you have to develop great relationships with your students. That's important, that's key. And part of that is the culture of education. And then for those who are teachers as well, you know that students learn in different ways. You have some students who, like what we're doing, they benefit more from hearing and seeing the information. But you have some people who they need to be active and involved in it. You know what I'm saying? They're kinesthetic learners. So the different learning modalities, that also needs to be taken into consideration. And the curriculum and the pedagogy has to be flexible to accommodate that stuff. But if we're saying it can only be done one way, and if you can't learn this way, then that's your problem. That's a problem. So let's go here, because how do we get this institution of education? When it comes to the English or the British, their first quote unquote successful colony is Jamestown, 1607. I'm going to refer to it as a colony and make sure that we continue to think of it that way, because they colonized land from indigenous people. You had the Powhatan Confederation in that area. Many of us, we know that the first way that we learn about that story is through the Western romanticized story of Pocahontas. That's the Powhatan Confederation. These were people who were living in this land. This was their land. You have the English colonists who come, steal land from them, and then begin to create more conflicts to take more and more land away from the Powhatan Confederation. It's colonizing. So we start there. So this is 1607. So from 1607 to 1619, in that colony of Jamestown, they don't develop any school. And in that period of time, you have young people that are in that colony. You have kids there. So, I mean, you might have parents that are teaching their kids on their own, but they made no effort to create a school in order to educate their young people. The very first school that they decide to create is this, the London Company School. And this sounds somewhat familiar to what we have 400 years later, because we have, you know, charter schools and some charter schools being funded by companies in order to be in areas that are being gentrified, or we might say being colonized now, to move Black and brown folks out of those areas. But this school had a very specific vision. It wasn't for the young English kids in the colony. They created this school to try to civilize or Christianize what they called the barbarians in Virginia. They were referring to the indigenous people. So this very first school that's established in the colonial period, which is going to lead to the history of the United States, is a weapon to try to change indigenous people into something that makes them more palatable for English colonists. Think about that. It wasn't a place where come as you are. You are welcomed in your identity. We have respect for you and your culture and your tradition. It was you come in here, we're going to change you into something else that makes it better for us to deal with you. This is an experience that many of our students deal with on a daily basis. They go to school, they're being forced to change into something else because their culture, their history, their tradition is not valued. Going back to the Marcus Garvey quote that we started off with, the people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. This is heavy. This is the first example of a school in the colonial experiment. Then they create another school. Well, they attempt to create another school 2 years later, the East India School, 1621. And this is the first time they create a school that is focused on the English children in the colony. But it doesn't last. There's a war effort that breaks out. The school never gets started. A few years after that, 1640. And another historical point to bring to our conversation, by 1619, you have Black people in the colony of Jamestown, because in August of 1619, the first, as they say, 20 some odd Negroes are brought to Jamestown. So by now, we also have Black people in the colony. All right, fast forward, 1640, the Sims School. This is the first, quote, free school in the colonies. And its purpose was to educate white children in the neighboring counties. So you have indigenous folks here, you have Black folks in the colony by now, but this was a school that was set up to only educate white children on stolen land and being paid for partially by forcibly enslaved labor. Let's continue. 1650s, a man by the name of Eaton. So Sims was a man who passed away, and he, gives this land for the school to be built on. Eaton, same thing. He's a man, he passes away. He gives this land to folks to build this school, but he also was somebody who forcibly enslaved Black folks. And so he attached those Black folks to the school in order to work the school for the school to remain open. So again, on stolen land, a school is built only to educate white kids. And in his will, he says that my two folks who I've forcibly enslaved, their job now is to work this school for these white kids to go to. We got to know this history, because this is the history that establishes a culture that's going to build an institution of education that's supposed to educate people for hundreds and hundreds of years. These are the first steps. These are the first pieces of this puzzle. So now let's flip it. Let's look at the Black experience with education in Virginia. One of the first attempts to try to create a school to bring education to forcibly enslaved Black folks is this right here, the Associates of Dr. Bray School, from 1760 to 1774. It didn't last a long time, not at all. Why? As we see on the slide. This was dedicated to educate forcibly enslaved children, but the caveat was this: a child could not attend school without the permission of the person who believed they were their owner. So if you're saying, I want to go to school, and your owner, slave master, is saying, you can't go to school, you ain't going to school. They built this into the culture of education in the colony of Virginia when it came to trying to provide education to these forcibly enslaved children. I say you go, I say you don't go. As a result, school didn't last that long. So there were two of these schools. One of them only lasted for about 5 to 6 years because there was so much pressure from the society around it saying, we don't want this school here educating Black kids. Shut it down or we're going to burn it down. They shut it down. The other one lasted a little bit longer, but then eventually had to close because of low enrollment. Makes sense, right? If you ain't getting permission to go to school, ain't no kids going to be in the school. So they had to shut it down. This is another very important piece to align with the story of education in the history of the colony that eventually becomes the country known as the United States of America. Almost any time there was a major uprising or a major movement to liberate forcibly enslaved Black people, the state responds with heavier laws and policies to make education more difficult for Black folks to obtain. And I'm gonna produce the historical receipts in a minute. This is one of those examples. Gabriel Prosser in the state of Virginia, because now this is a state under the Constitution at the time, he begins organizing what would be one of the largest uprisings and rebellions. The goal of Gabriel Prosser's rebellion was to take the current governor of Virginia hostage in order to negotiate for the freedom of all forcibly enslaved Black folks. He had 3 different columns that were moving on the parts of the Capitol. I mean, it was a genius plan, but somebody told. After that, more restrictions put in place. Nat Turner, 1831, also Virginia history. Same thing, leads a major uprising to liberate forcibly enslaved people, and understand that was a moral and a right and a justified thing to do. If people are taking your livelihood, your freedom away, you have the right to be free. And It doesn't make sense to say that the colonists had a right to be free through the Revolutionary War, but you can't say that forcibly enslaved people didn't have a right to be free. That don't make sense. So Nat Turner leads one of the largest uprisings of forcibly enslaved people. Immediately after that, heck of laws on the books. We don't want them educated. We don't want them reading. We don't want them writing. Nat Turner knew how to read and write. He uses education in order to empower himself and to empower others and to organize people. We can't have more examples like that. This is the same culture that then develops classrooms, schools, school districts that are supposed to educate Black folks. The same culture that's had this response time and time again to say, when they begin moving, empowered through an education, we don't want them to be educated. So just a quick way for us to look at what can be considered Black anti-literacy laws. From 1740 to 1865, multiple laws are codified in different colonies and states to prevent Black folks from being able to read or write or be educated. Let's get some examples. And we're staying on Virginia because Virginia is the first colony. And as a result, Virginia becomes the most powerful or important colony and then becomes the most powerful or important state in the early part of the United States. So what Virginia does, many other colonies want to follow after, or many other states want to follow after, or they respect. So let's look at some of these. In 1640, so now Black folks have been in Jamestown for 21 years. Remember 1619. So by the time we get to 1640, you have the first Black man sentenced to lifetime enslavement. So he tried to liberate himself, and he tried to liberate himself with two other white companions. All of them get captured. The two white companions, they get, far lesser penalties. Their indenture gets extended for a couple more years. The Black man, however, is sentenced to a lifetime of enslavement. 1660. They put on the books, white folks running away with Black folks will be in prison, to try to discourage that from happening. 1662, running away is illegal. People taking away your freedom, right? You are in the moral right position, the ethical right position to say, I want to be free, but they create laws to say that you running away, that's illegal. And then they go further saying that babies are born into bondage. So if you are a parent, you're a mother, you're giving birth to your child and you're forcibly enslaved, your child is also forcibly enslaved. And this is one of the major pivots when people talk about institutions of slavery that have existed throughout time in other parts of the world. Never before have you seen an institution like what we experienced here in the Western Hemisphere after Columbus, where generations, all of your progeny is also considered property. This was different, and it needs to be referred to with language that reflects the difference of it. 1667, if you thought that religion was going to be an out for you, it's not. If you get baptized in the Christian faith, that ain't gonna make you free. If you're Black. 1669, no punishment for killing an enslaved person. This right here, right? Like, this is an important correlation with what we see in the United States now. Phones is out, recording police interactions, police guns is out, bullets flying into Black bodies being killed, brown bodies being killed, police officers not being held accountable or going into a court of law and being found completely innocent. It's historical. It began way back there. No punishment for killing an enslaved person. 1680, Blacks can't be armed, can't leave the plantation without documentation. You can't be armed, you can't protect yourself, you can't defend yourself. Let's continue. 1682, no miscegenation. Black folks, white folks can't be in relationships together. Murder of a forcibly enslaved person is treated as if nothing happened. They doubled down on that. If you kill somebody who's forcibly enslaved, we're gonna treat it as if nothing happened. And we see, like, Black folks now, we're not going to say that they're forcibly enslaved. Some of us might say that. But in the court of law today, 2021, 2022, you have civilians, Trayvon Martin being killed by, I'm forgetting dude's name. I don't want to remember his name right now, but we know what we're talking about. Court of law, nothing happened. You innocent. Police officers, you innocent. Historical foundation for it right here. The third part of this, no Black person can raise their hands to defend themselves. So 1680, you can't be armed. 1682, you can't even raise your hands to defend yourself. 1691, 1692, adding more severity to the 1682 law. 1705, if you ain't familiar with that, feel free. Look, all of this stuff is historical. You can Google search Slave Code of 1705 in Virginia. You'll see all this stuff in there. I ain't making none of this up. 1723, Black folks can't meet. Free Blacks can't be armed. So if you're enslaved, forcibly enslaved, you can't be armed. If you're free, you can't be armed. 3, reducing the number of free Blacks in Virginia, and also they can't vote. And then 1740, the Slave Code of 1740, Blacks can't gather. They can't raise their own food. Think about that. You saying that, so I can't gather with my folk, I can't eat, I can't earn money, and you can't learn to write, and you can be killed if rebellious. So 1740, something must have happened in order for them to come down like that, saying you can't gather, you can't raise your own food, you can't earn money, you can't learn to write, and you can be killed if you are rebellious. What happened around 1740 for Virginia to respond in that way? We're going to come back to that in a minute. I got ahead of myself, right? I'm getting excited. Let me bring that back on y'all. So 1739, we have something called the Stono Rebellion, S-T-O-N-O, the Stono Rebellion. You had forcibly enslaved folks who said, we're out, we're leaving, we're going to Florida. Why were they going to Florida? Florida was controlled by the Spanish, and the Spanish were saying, if anybody comes and fights with us against the British, we'll give you your freedom. Black folks said, that sounds good to us, we out. So you have this large group of Black folks who begin to mobilize, and they march South Carolina, Virginia, heading to Florida. Folks didn't want that. They want to stop that. At the front of their march, they had a banner that they created for themselves, and they wrote the word liberty on it, L-I-B-E-R-T-Y, marching proudly, drumming, all of that. Big banner that says liberty. Because they were marching for their freedom with a banner that says liberty, immediately after they smash or they squash the Stono Rebellion, Virginia responds with this slave code of 1740. You can't gather because that might lead to another Stono Rebellion. You can't raise food because that's going to make you stronger to be able to go out there and try to liberate yourself. You can't earn money, and you can't learn to write because you might write more signs that say freedom or liberty or whatever. So what we see is this: Black minds that are educated and empowering themselves with education in the colonial period were always a threat to the colonial authority. And so they wanted to create laws, policies, institutions that limited Black people from being able to develop their minds and then exercise the power of their minds. So then the next slide that I was showing you, this is a preview. This is something that came out recently. I would encourage you to take a look at it if you want. So this was put out by the Washington Post. They did this, they created this database to look at how many members of Congress. So, right, we got our 3 different branches of government. You got the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and all the federal courts underneath that. You have the executive branch, the branch of the president. And then you have the legislative branch, House of Representatives, the Senate, Congress. So in terms of presidential history, out of the first 18 presidents, you had 12 that forcibly enslaved Black folks. So out of the first 18 presidents in the history of the United States, 2/3 of them forcibly enslaved Black folks. We can have a conversation about Supreme Court justices that did that. There's a significant number of them as well. So now looking at how many people in Congress, the lawmakers, more than 1,700 congressmen once enslaved Black people. This is who they were and how they shaped the nation. Quick slide right here, because there's a lot of stuff in the database. You see in the, I think for you, it's going to be the far right corner, the box, the white box. For the first 18 years of American lawmaking from 1789 to 1807, more than half the men elected to Congress each session were slaveholders. You feel me? And this ain't even saying anything about their view of indigenous people and how indigenous people are being treated. We're talking about the way that Black people are being viewed and being treated. You have more than half of the people that make the laws on a federal level, and they also have influence on a state level, who profit off of forcibly enslaving Black people. And it's sad, right? Like I ain't making this stuff up, and it's just the history. This ain't critical race theory, you feel me? We just looking at the history. That's all this is. This country has thoroughly been founded on racist practices that have negatively impacted indigenous people and Black folks. This is how the United States has built itself up. And then we bring other people into the story as more folks begin to immigrate and migrate, and we see their experiences as well. But the two seminal experiences of people or communities that have been exploited and oppressed in order to build this stuff up have been the indigenous communities and the Black community. That is a fact. And every time states or the federal government have had an opportunity in order to right those wrongs, they've doubled down on their decision in order to oppress those communities more. And this is the same country, these states, the federal government that's going to be developing institutions of education that are supposed to educate Black children properly. It's not possible. So I'm just trying to give us a snapshot of the historical context for why we see what we see, for why Huey was talking about what he talked about when he was going to school, when he was a young person here in Oakland. Because this history shapes the institution. We talked about the 1740 law following the Stoner Rebellion. 1829 Georgia Act. Let's look at this one. To prevent the circulation of written or printed papers within the state, calculated to excite disaffection among the colored people of the state and to prevent said people from being taught to read and write. Georgia went hard in 1829. Why? Because of something called David Walker's Appeal. David Walker publishes his appeal in 1829. It's a fiery revolutionary work that inspired Black folks all throughout the United States. You got people selling the book, smuggling it down in the southern states. Georgia says, we don't want anybody reading this work. So we want to create more obstacles for Black folks to be able to read and write. That's what I'm saying. Almost immediately, anytime the Black community tried to mobilize itself and empower itself through its knowledge and its information, you see the state respond in ways to prevent that. 1832, Alabama and Virginia anti-literacy laws prohibiting whites from teaching Blacks to read or write. What does this follow? This follows August of 1831, Nat Turner. Nat Turner leads the rebellion in August of 1831. Immediately after that, January, February of 1832, Alabama and Virginia say this. Can't read or write, prohibiting whites from teaching Black folks to read or write. 1833, still the momentum of the Nat Turner uprising. Georgia anti-literacy law that prohibited Black people from working and reading and writing jobs. This law also made it illegal to teach Black people to read. 1847, Missouri Act. No person shall keep or teach any school for the instruction of Negroes or mulattoes in reading or writing in this state. This is the backdrop, y'all, for real. This is the backdrop. When we talk about public education, we get it in this, romanticized way of like, oh, these schools are really going to educate our kid for real. This is the history that this institution was built upon. So let's go a little bit deeper, right? 1860, at the close to the start of the Civil War, you have more than 4 million Black folks in the country, in the United States. 90% of them are forcibly enslaved. The vision, so going back to that question about stereotypes, the vision, the purpose that this colony and this country have had for Black people has been, you are my property. I profit off of you. You work for me. I make money off of you. I make money off your kids. You do what I say. When you operate outside of that, that's a problem for me. And that's not me just saying that, right? 12 out of the first 18 presidents forcibly enslaved Black folks. As we saw, more than 1,700 folks who were in Congress from the beginning of this country in 1789 under the Constitution, all the way up into the 1900s, forcibly enslaved Black folks in their lifetime. This was a mandate of the US government, of the states in the United States, to preserve this position of forced enslavement or control of Black bodies. If they run away and try to get free, we got to make that illegal because we need them there to make our money off of them. So more than 90% at the start of the Civil War are forcibly enslaved. 9 out of 10 Black folks in this country are forcibly enslaved. So when you see a Black person, what are you thinking? Oh, you forcibly enslaved. That's part of the stereotype. And then also, we don't want you to read or write. We don't want to value what you carry, the genius and the greatness that you carry in your mind or you carry in your body. And we certainly ain't going to try to cultivate that. Because if that happens, you might use that on your own terms to operate it as a self-determining, independent, free person. We don't want that. So let's look at one of the most extreme examples of wanting to control Black folks, and that's the establishment of the Confederate States of America. And make no mistake, the Confederacy was established in order to forcibly enslave Black people forever. They put that in their Constitution. And if you don't believe me, here are parts of their Constitution where it says that. Article 1, Section 9, this is from the Confederate Constitution of the United States. No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. They said there's never going to be any law or anything ever passed that's going to prevent us from being able to forcibly enslave Black people. And then these people have the audacity in history classes now to try to teach folks that the Civil War was fought because of state rights. No, it wasn't. It was fought because the Confederacy wanted to forcibly enslave Black people wherever it was at. That was it. They didn't just say it once. They said it multiple times. I didn't even pull everything from the Confederate Constitution that speaks about forcibly enslaving Black folks. But we'll read this one. This is Article 4, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property. And the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. They said if you have somebody forcibly enslaved and you in Georgia and you want to go to Texas, they'll be your property in Texas as well. You want to go to Tennessee, they're going to be your property in Tennessee as well. It don't matter where you go in the Confederacy, that is your property. And then no slave or other person held to service or labor in any state or territory of the Confederate States under the laws thereof, escaping or lawfully carried into another state, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such slave belongs or to who such service or labor may be due. If you escape, or if you move to another place, you will never be discharged of your condition of enslavement. Now, these are the same states, right? Let's look at it. This is the Confederacy. South Carolina, the first state to secede. Mississippi, my family comes from Mississippi. Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee. These are the states that made up the Confederacy. Now let's look at them and fast forward a little bit to this whole conversation about critical race theory. So these were the states that wanted to forcibly enslave Black people forever. South Carolina, they got a bill pending. Mississippi, they tried to pass the bill, it failed. They're gonna try again. Florida, passed their bill. No critical race theory. And we know they ain't teaching critical race theory in the schools, but what they're really saying is we don't want any of this history taught. Alabama, bill pending change. Georgia, passed. Louisiana, bill failed. They're gonna try again. We'll see what happens. Texas, state law. Virginia, no action taken as of yet. We'll see. Arkansas, state law. North Carolina, bill pending. Tennessee, state law. You see how the history, sometimes people, they feel more comfortable by saying, well, that was in the past. That's history. That's over with. No, it ain't. No, it's not. Just like we saw those laws saying, if you kill a forcibly enslaved person, we're gonna treat it as if nothing happened. That ain't just in the past. This history influences the present. It influences the institutions that evolve over time. So let's look at this. Brief history of Black education, the Black education experience from 1619 to 1865. In many parts of colonial and constitutional America, it was illegal for a Black person to be educated. And we're going to trust these people for more than 200 years who said, we don't want you to be educated, to then create schools that are going to properly educate Black kids? Who does that? As Malcolm said, only a fool will allow his enemy to educate his children. 1861 to the 1900s, we see the development of historical Black colleges and universities, and many of them still being overseen by white authorities. 1865 to 1877, we have the period that historians like to refer to as Reconstruction. During that time, you have the establishment of a federal agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, and we start seeing federal funding being used in order to establish schools and schools that would educate Black people. 1896 through 1954, 1955, we have the Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal period. And it actually begins before that because 1896 is only when the Plessy v. Ferguson case gets to the Supreme Court. So the incident that led to the Plessy v. Ferguson case happened years before that. And in multiple states, we can identify where there were already segregationist policies that existed in those states. But anyway, this is the period that people refer to as the separate but equal education period. And then 1954, 1955, we have the Brown v. Board of Education decision of Topeka, Kansas, where the Supreme Court says public accommodations need to be integrated or desegregated with all deliberate speed. We still waiting for that in 2022. 1955 to the present, this is what school looks like. You got forced integration. So as was mentioned, I'm a Bay Area product. I'm from the South Bay originally. So I'm born and raised east side of San Jose. When I went to high school, I was able to go to a school on the other side of the city. I was bused. They had these magnet programs. So as a Black kid, I could pick any school that I wanted to go to in the city because it was part of forced integration. Defunding public school education, rise of private and charter schools. We see that. Compare Oakland to Berkeley. How many charter schools in Berkeley? Very few. How many charter schools we got here in Oakland? We'd be counting probably to the end of this session. And that's not just here. We see that in multiple other parts of the country where we have that. And that's not to say that all private schools are bad, but we have multiple private schools that are operating in a predatory way, that are exploiting the community and using Black and brown folks to get money, to get property, whatever it might be. That's another conversation. School to prison pipeline. NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and Common Core standards. This is part of what we see now, moving more into the present moment. At this very moment, although we're in this hybrid distance learning COVID, prior to that, prior to March 13th, 2020, we had new school segregation on par with what segregation was like in the late 50s and the early 60s throughout this country. And now we got distance learning without cultural relevancy and whatever else we're doing just to try to survive this COVID moment. Is what it looks like. Jim Crow cars. So this is the Plessy v. Ferguson stuff. So now let's widen the perspective a little bit. And I also want you to see the title of this. So our institutions love to use, as they refer to it as politically correct language, and use language that minimizes the harm. So we'll say, minority populations or underserved, underrepresented. That's not what it is. It's an intentional underserving. It's an intentional underrepresentation. Decisions are being made, and we see that because we've seen the history of these policies and these laws being put into place since the early 1600s. Come on now. It didn't just happen. Decisions were made in order to create this context. So other intentional underservings of communities of color. So when it comes to indigenous folks, we have the history of the Indian missionary schools. So again, similar to that London company school that we talked about in 1619, we're not respecting indigenous people for who they are. We're trying to turn them into something else. Then they double down on that. Indian boarding schools. And the mantra of the Indian boarding school was to kill the Indian within and save the man. This is part of the culture of education here in the United States, y'all. Curriculum is being developed. Teachers are being trained in order to do specific things to be effective in these spaces. You don't see the people. You see them as a thing that needs to be turned into something else, or a thing that needs to be controlled. And let's localize it. Let's keep it to some California, some Bay Area history. In 1866, there's a California law that gets passed that allows the state superintendent to withhold funding from schools with Chinese students. 1870, California school law that legally segregates indigenous and Black students. 1871 through 1885, you have Chinese students are denied state education funding. A lot of this is happening right here in the Bay Area. Oakland has one of the oldest Chinatowns. Of course, San Francisco has one of the oldest Chinatowns. So a lot of this was concentrated right here in the Bay Area. The Oriental Public School System established in 1885, which was for Asian students, primarily Chinese students. There's some Japanese students in there as well, but it was a segregated school system for them. Mendez versus Westminster, very important Supreme Court decision. This may have been high federal court, but this comes out of LA Unified School District, the Mendez family suing LA Unified for segregationist practices. And this predates Brown v. Board of Education. Matter of fact, I think it is Supreme Court. Diaz versus San Jose Unified School District. So this was a case that originated in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, you have the Diaz family that sues San Jose Unified School District, one of the oldest school districts in California, for segregationist practices. The deciding court case happens in 1986. So it took more than 10 years in order for a decision to be administered, and the decision came down that San Jose Unified was engaging in segregationist and discriminatory practices. Here's some other cases that focus on education in communities challenging for equal access or adequate access. Lum v. Rice, Mendez versus Westminster, Brown v. Board of Education, Lau versus Nichols, Diaz versus San Jose Unified, as we talked about, Myers versus the Board of Education of San Juan in 1995. People still fighting from different communities for quality access. But why do they have to fight? They're fighting because the historical foundation was based on exploitation and oppression of indigenous folk and exploitation and oppression of Black folk. And it just spilled out into other communities as well. Brown v. Board of Education. Immediately in the process of trying to integrate schools, this is what folks were experiencing. I want you to think about this in light of that Dr. Bray School. So remember that was one of the first schools that was established in Virginia to try to provide education for forcibly enslaved Black kids, right? So what we saw there, one of the schools only lasted for 5 to 6 years because the people in the area surrounding it said, you either shut the school down or we gonna burn the school down because we don't want these kids being educated over here. That same energy is present in this photo right here. But that historical connection probably hasn't been made for you before. That same energy saying, shut this school down because we don't want Black kids being educated, is here with the Little Rock Nine trying to fulfill the Supreme Court order of desegregating public accommodations in schools, young kids trying to go to school to get an education. the Little Rock community coming out in droves to terrorize and traumatize these Black kids who were trying to go to school. And so this don't say nothing about the curriculum that they was being taught, the pedagogy, nothing, none of that. And then I don't know like how familiar you are with this history, but this student right here, she talked about how when she was in school, one of the first day that she was in school, she was in the class, she was hoping that the teacher would intervene on her behalf because the students were in there just calling her the N-word, just nigga, 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 nigga this. And she's looking at the teacher, you gonna do something about that? Teacher don't do nothing. Come on now. It don't matter how old, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, trying to go to first grade, got to be escorted by law enforcement agents because there are people trying to intimidate her, traumatize her, trying to scare her from going to school. And we in the 1960s now. So then, right, this is like the culture of education reform, and we're getting ready to start wrapping it up. So in the quote unquote progressive education era, this is the early 1900s, important names that come from that. You got Francis Parker, you got John Dewey, you got John Dewey schools throughout the country, you know what I'm saying? Like celebrated educational philosopher or theorist. You had tracked education, IQ tests, standardized tests. So much of that was weaponized against Black, brown, indigenous, other people of color. The Stanford-Binet test was developed in a racist way. Like, oh, I'm not making it. The history is there. Connected to the eugenicist movements. The eugenicist movement, of course, being one of the inspirations for Hitler's Nazi Germany machine that he builds. Looking at what people were doing in the United States through the eugenicist movement. Oh, that's what they're doing. Let's try to do that here. That philosophy, that approach, it inspired the IQ testing. It inspired standardized testings. The SATs are developed in that history, in the context of eugenicist America. I'm not making it up. That's the history. Then we get into the Cold War. So after World War II, moving into the Cold War, the United States starts to spend more money on public education through the National Defense Education Act. Space race, like all this stuff is going on. More money going into public education. During the Civil Rights period, Economic Opportunity Act 1964, you get more money that's being put into public education. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, you have money that's going into the establishment of preschools, but another place where money went, it went into police departments, law enforcement agencies, and this is one of the first times that we start seeing SROs, school resource officers, on campuses. Now, looking at what we talk about now, standards-based education movement, a nation at risk. That's something that, you know, you can check out if you want to, but this is one of those foundational elements for what they call the standards-based education movement. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind, Common Core Standards. And I'm gonna take you through these slides real quick and then I'll stop the share. This woman right here, Susie Pimentel, helped design the California content standards. So for folks who are educators, you got to teach your math standards, your social science standards, English standards. Sue Pimentel was a major figure in the development of all those California content standards. This is law in the state of California. When it comes to social studies, she got no social studies experience. The group that they convened in order to develop the social studies standards, also nobody has social studies experience. Certainly not multicultural, inclusive, historical, educational knowledge, ways to center the indigenous, the Black experience, Asian experience, anything. They didn't have that. So they developed, similar to what we've seen before, a content or a curriculum standard that does not have any inclusive, multicultural focus at all. And then when people criticize that, they made, you know, minute changes, but this is an instrument that influences California schools to this day, and it is rooted in a Western, white supremacist, white-centric view of the world. And this is what our students are still learning from. Then Sue Pimentel pops up again when the Common Core standards get developed. So she plays a role in the development of the California content standards, and then she plays a role in the development of the Common Core standards, and the Common Core standards affect At the height, they affected 45 states throughout this country. One woman. And this ain't a, like, because it's not that, because she's a woman, it's not that. One person had the ability to influence millions and millions of students throughout this country. And she does not have a background in any of this stuff that we're talking about. And then these other folks here, like, let's go back to this. Yeah, none of them do. None of them do. And that's not just because of the pictures. They're not scientists, mathematicians. I mean, they can be intelligent folks, but they don't have a background in trying to teach in ways that respect other cultural approaches to education, that are able to center other histories, voices, experiences, nothing, none of that. But they've created an instrument that has influenced states throughout this country. It's wild. And then, of course, schools being segregated. I mean, like, this is important. It's not that it's less important now because we're in this COVID moment. Like, this is the institution of education. So going back to what Marcus Garvey said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Our students are being sent to schools that do not value them because this institution has never valued them. They're being forced to learn from a curriculum that doesn't include their history, their culture, their tradition, that doesn't know how to decolonize the view of themselves or the view of this world. And then teachers who are not being prepared adequately. And then teachers who might be coming to the space with those same stereotypes of Black folks. It is not a formula for success. So the work that, and it's not to like big up the OLC, but like, it's important for spaces like this to be created so we can learn. But what's more important is, what are we going to do? Because we can have these conversations all day long. We can talk about it, sounds great. What are we going to do? And if we're not doing anything about it, then we're allowing the same thing which has existed for centuries. That's no exaggeration. We've looked at some of that history. We talked about stuff from the 1600s to 1700s to 1800s. We're in the 2000s for centuries. If we're not doing something about it, we're allowing it to continue. It's just going to perpetuate. So what are we willing to do? Some of us might be more willing to do something than others, which is all right. I mean, that's how change happens. Some folks step up to do something. I'm not claiming I'm the example, but that is part of the reason why I wrote my book, Black Boy Poems. So it's not just a book of poetry. It is a revolutionary manifesto which centers the Black experience and brings in so much valuable information and uses culturally relevant ways of delivering content. Created the curriculum, established Freedom Soul Media Education initiatives. One of my homies, I saw him, he's on the call, Dr. Khalid White. He's part of an organization that we founded called the Black Literary Collective, 10 Black authors that created published works and programs and curriculum that we can bring to the community, that we can bring to schools, that can be resources in order to disrupt and interrupt and create new educational opportunities so students can learn, grow, thrive, learn about themselves, learn about others, learn about the world, and learn about what they can do in order to influence and impact the world. That's an education, fam. But that right there has never been the goal of the colony that eventually became the United States of America, because when indigenous people begin to act for themselves and say, we want our land back, well, that's a problem. When Black people say, we want to be free, oh, that's a problem. So we can't empower you that way, because if you do that, you become a threat to what we have going. And it's been good. We've been getting this good money for centuries. You know what I'm saying? We're the strongest country on the planet for the past 70 some odd years. We don't want to lose that. So you can't have your land back. You can't have an education that's truly, you can't have reparations, although we stole billions and trillions of dollars from your people. You can't have that. So you certainly ain't gonna have a quality education. So we have to do something, because that institution is gonna continue to do what it's been doing for centuries. And I think I didn't intend to speak as much as I did. I said something about like, y'all can put questions in the chat. I ain't looked at none of them questions. My bad for that, right? We got a couple minutes before this is over. I don't know if people want to share some thoughts, reflections, ask questions. It's cool. But like I said in the beginning, I hope that you felt this was beneficial. I really do. I know there's a lot that was discussed, but I really hope that it was cool. Thank you, OLC, for allowing me to be a part of it. Again, my name is Tyson Amir. We're in community. Let's be in contact. Let's keep this moving, and let's do something that's really going to be about change, empowering and liberating minds, bodies, liberating the people. That's what needs to be a part of an education. All right, I'm gonna go on mute now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyson. I didn't have any that I saw questions, so if I missed it, please do repost that. I think I've been monitoring, so I would have let you know if there were coming. I just see one right now on, could you review your earlier comment on charter and private schools in Oakland? Before I have you do that, since I know some people might trickle off really quickly, I put a link to the evaluation. So if you are heading off a few minutes early, please do take a moment to do that. And we put a link to our session next month, which I think is a great segue, Tyson, to what Bray is going to be talking about at our training in February. That is her literacy lab case study, the building liberatory learning spaces. So hers is really about kind of how do we design those spaces that are liberatory. So please check out that information. And if you're not on our newsletter, that's how you will find out. That one is free to our member organizations, and it's just $20 for anybody else. So again, the question that was in here was if you could review your comment about the Oakland and charter schools.
Okay, that's a much larger and longer discussion, but you have charter schools, right? And there's a big, debate about them, but you have some charter schools that are here in Oakland right now that operate in ways that, with a critical and an objective lens, are not really serving the community. And then they're able to move around the ed code in ways too that don't hold them accountable the same way that OUSD schools have to move. So if you have students that become a little bit more difficult for you to provide service to, it's a little bit easier for those charter schools to move those students out. And then also when we look at where charter schools are popping up, they're popping up more so in communities where you have communities of color. So Black communities, historical, Latino communities here in Oakland. And then by comparison, if we were to look at, say, Walnut Creek in charter schools, or we were to look at Berkeley in charter schools, why is it that you don't see charter schools popping up the same way in cities like that, where you have smaller populations of Black and brown people, as you do in Oakland, or say in East Palo Alto, or we could talk about San Francisco, although we got San Francisco now around 2.5% Black. Like we see the way that they're being used in certain spaces. We could talk about charter schools in San Francisco. I mean, not San Francisco, in Chicago. We could talk about charter schools in New Orleans. We could talk about charter schools in Memphis, Tennessee. Like we can look at that and then compare those with cities in the area where you have more white families and also like more affluent white families, and you're not going to see them used the same way. So that is another, conversation and another thing that we have to address when we're talking about trying to create learning spaces that are about empowering our young people. And that's going to require, as I was saying, like towards the end of my statement, people have to be active, people got to be involved, and they have to do something about it. Whatever institution is providing education, whether it's a public school, and Huey was talking about OUSD. So this is not me saying that public versus private or charter. All these schools have been formed by the same historical context. And if we're analyzing them and how Black students have been served or Indigenous students have been served in those institutions, we're going to see that they're all failing. So it's not about that. People have to hold those things accountable. And we have to move in ways where we have a very clear agenda. We're strategic about what we want, and we make those institutions function in that way in order to serve those students and to serve those communities appropriately so they can have the type of education that they're supposed to get.
Thank you for that. We are just at time. If there are other questions in the eval, you can also leave kind of things you're wondering, walking away with, both to help us think about how we can add additional resources or a future session. So use that to do that there. Or if we can't get to the question today, we can still think about how to share that. I drop links to Tyson's website. It also has a link to the book and where he talks about the curriculum he's developed. And I also shared that we'll be releasing, we always have our book lists on our website. You can find them that we keep updated year round. We'll be sharing a few more links in that updated one for Black History Month, but specifically also in time for the Ed Fund read-in, which I know many folks will participate in. But in this moment, if we have other specifically Black African-American authors and voices, please drop the link to your work in the chat directly. Both we will make sure we add it in, but also share what you're working on with others directly. And so with that, please join me again in just another thank you to Tyson. We have lots of links of how you can stay in touch, and don't forget to take an eval. So thank you all so much for being here this morning. Bye, everybody. Thank you.